Gilgo Beach murders. The road to Gilgo Beach is long and quiet. Ocean Parkway stretches across the barrier island like a thin ribbon of asphalt. On one side, the Atlantic Ocean crashes endlessly against the sand. On the other, miles of thick, marshy brush. It's the kind of place where almost no one walks. The kind of place where something could disappear and stay hidden for years. For decades, drivers passed along that road without knowing what lay just feet away in the tall grass. Bodies. Not one, not two, but many. Women who vanished from motel rooms, Craigslist ads, and late-night phone calls. Women whose families searched for answers, while the killer who took them continued living a normal life. Working, driving, blending into society. The truth would remain buried along Ocean Parkway for years, until one missing person search uncovered something investigators never expected. A discovery that would reveal one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in modern American history. This is the story of the Gilgo Beach murders and the secrets hidden along a quiet stretch of highway. This is Unsaid Case Files. On the night of May 1st, 2010, a young woman arrived in the quiet beach community of Oak Beach on Long Island. Her name was Shannan Gilbert. She was 24 years old. Like many women trying to survive in New York City, Shannan had turned to escort work. She advertised her services online and traveled with a driver to meet clients. That night, she had arranged to meet a client in a gated community near the water. But something went wrong. At 4:51 in the morning, Shannan placed a frantic call to 911. For nearly 20 minutes, she spoke with the dispatcher, her voice panicked and confused. She kept repeating the same terrifying claim. Someone was after her. Someone was trying to kill her. But the call was strange. Shannan struggled to explain where she was or what exactly was happening. At times, she sounded terrified. At other moments, confused. Then suddenly, she ran. She fled the house of the client, running barefoot into the darkness of the quiet neighborhood. Residents later reported seeing her knocking on doors, screaming for help. One homeowner allowed her inside briefly, but when told police were on the way, Shannan panicked again. She ran back into the night. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. She disappeared into the marshland surrounding Oak Beach. For months, her family begged authorities to search for her. Finally, in December 2010, Suffolk County Police began a search along Ocean Parkway, the long stretch of road that runs along the barrier island. Officers were looking for one missing woman, but what they were about to find would change the entire case. Because hidden in the brush just off the highway was something far worse than anyone expected. On December 11th, 2010, a Suffolk County police officer began searching along Ocean Parkway. The officer, John Malia, wasn't alone. With him was a trained cadaver dog named Blue. They weren't expecting to find much. The search was simply another attempt to locate Shannan Gilbert. The area along the highway was thick with brush and reeds, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet into the vegetation. But cadaver dogs don't rely on sight. They rely on scent. As Officer Malia and Blue walked along the shoulder of the road, The dog suddenly stopped. Then Blue began pulling toward the dense brush. The dog had caught something. Malia followed the dog into the tall grass. Just a short distance from the roadway, they found something disturbing lying in the vegetation. Human remains. The body had been wrapped in burlap. At first, investigators believed they had finally located Shannan Gilbert. But the remains didn't belong to her. The victim was later identified as Melissa Barthelemy, a 24-year-old woman who had disappeared more than a year earlier. Police quickly realized something chilling. Melissa hadn't simply been dumped there randomly. Her body had been carefully placed, hidden just far enough into the brush that passing drivers would never notice. As investigators searched the surrounding area for evidence, they made an even more disturbing discovery. Another body. Then another. And another. Within hours, police uncovered the remains of 4 women, all located within a few hundred feet of each other along Ocean Parkway. The victims were later identified as Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello. The media soon gave them a name, the Gilgo Four, and their discovery raised a terrifying possibility. Someone had been using the same remote stretch of road as a dumping ground for murder. As investigators worked the crime scene along Ocean Parkway, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The 4 women found near Gilgo Beach had never met each other. They came from different states, different backgrounds, different lives. But they all had one thing in common. Each of them had worked as escorts and advertised their services online. Police quickly realized these were not random victims. Someone had been targeting women in the sex trade. One of the victims, Melissa Barthelemy, had disappeared in July 2009 while living in the Bronx. After she vanished, something deeply disturbing began happening. For weeks, her younger sister received phone calls from a man using Melissa's cell phone. The caller mocked her, insulted her, and repeatedly asked if she was a prostitute like her sister. Investigators later traced some of those calls to areas in Manhattan and Long Island, but they were unable to identify the person responsible. The calls eventually stopped, but the cruelty of them revealed something about the killer. He wasn't just hiding the bodies. He was taunting the victims' families. Another victim, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, disappeared in 2007. She was a young mother from Connecticut struggling to support her children. After receiving an eviction notice, she traveled to New York City to meet a client. She was never seen again. Then there was Waterman, a 22-year-old mother from Maine. She had come to Long Island in 2010 and was staying at a motel in Hauppauge while advertising escort services online. She told her boyfriend she was stepping out to meet a client. She promised to call later. She never did. And finally, Amber Lynn Costello, a 27-year-old woman living just a few miles from Gilgo Beach. Shortly before she disappeared, a man repeatedly called her, offering $2,500 for a meeting. It was far more money than most clients offered. Too good to ignore. Witnesses later told police they saw Amber leave her house to meet the man. He was driving a dark green pickup truck. She got into the vehicle, and she was never seen again. To investigators, the similarities were impossible to ignore. All four victims were petite women. All had advertised escort services online. All had vanished after meeting a client. And all were discovered along the same lonely stretch of highway. It suggested something terrifying. The killer knew the area extremely well. He knew exactly where to hide the bodies. And for years, no one had noticed. But what police didn't realize yet was that the graves hidden along Ocean Parkway were only the beginning. After the discovery of the Gilgo Four, investigators realized something chilling. If four victims had been hidden along Ocean Parkway, there might be more. In March 2011, police returned to the area and expanded their search east and west along the highway. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears. Additional human remains began appearing in the brush along the roadway. One of those victims was Jessica Taylor. Jessica had disappeared in 2003 while working as an escort in Manhattan. Years earlier, parts of her body had already been discovered in a wooded area in Manorville, New York. But investigators never knew where the rest of her remains were, until now. Along Ocean Parkway, search teams discovered additional bones that were later matched to Jessica through DNA testing. It meant something horrifying. Her body had been dismembered, and the killer had scattered the remains across different locations on Long Island. Not long after that discovery, police uncovered remains belonging to another victim, a woman who had been missing for 2 decades. Her name was Valerie Mack. She had disappeared around the year 2000 while working as an escort in the Northeast. Just like Jessica Taylor, parts of her body had previously been found years earlier in Manorville. And now investigators had found the rest. The similarities between the two victims were impossible to ignore. Both had been dismembered. Both had body parts dumped in Manorville. And both had additional remains hidden near Gilgo Beach. This suggested something investigators feared from the very beginning. The killer responsible for the Gilgo Four might have been killing for far longer than anyone realized, possibly for decades. And the deeper police searched along Ocean Parkway, the more victims they found. As the search along Ocean Parkway continued in 2011, investigators realized that not every victim could immediately be identified. Some of the remains discovered had been there for many years, so long that names had been lost. One of the most mysterious victims became known only as Asian Doe. Police determined the victim was biologically male, but had been dressed in women's clothing. Investigators believed the victim may have been a transgender woman or a cross-dressing sex worker. The victim was estimated to be between 17 and 23 years old. Their cause of death was blunt force trauma. Despite sketches and forensic reconstructions released by investigators, the victim's identity remains unknown. For years, no family came forward. No missing persons report matched the description. Just another life that vanished without answers. Another victim remained unidentified for decades. She was known only as Jane Doe number 7. Years earlier, in 1996, a pair of severed legs had been discovered inside a garbage bag on Fire Island. At the time, investigators had no idea who the victim was. Then in 2011, more skeletal remains were discovered near Ocean Parkway. DNA testing eventually revealed the shocking truth. The two discoveries belonged to the same woman. Her name was Karen Vergata. But it would take more than 25 years before investigators finally learned who she was. Another disturbing case involved a woman investigators called Jane Doe number 6. For years, police only had partial remains discovered in the woods of Manorville in 2000. When additional bones were discovered near Gilgo Beach in 2011, DNA testing confirmed they belonged to the same victim. In 2020, investigators finally identified her. Her name was Valerie Mack. She had been a young mother who disappeared while working as an escort. Like many of the other victims, she had never been officially reported missing. And that fact revealed one of the darkest parts of the Gilgo Beach case. Many of these women lived on the margins of society. They struggled with poverty, addiction, or dangerous work that forced them into meeting strangers alone. When they vanished, their disappearances often received little attention. Years passed before anyone realized they were gone. For the killer, that may have been exactly what made them targets. But the growing number of victims raised a terrifying question. If police had already discovered 10 sets of human remains along Ocean Parkway, how many more victims were still out there? And more importantly, who had been hunting them? By the end of 2011, the Gilgo Beach investigation had become one of the largest serial murder cases in modern American history. Police had discovered 10 sets of human remains scattered along Ocean Parkway and nearby areas. But despite the scale of the investigation, there was no suspect. The killer had left behind very little evidence. Investigators did learn a few disturbing details. Several of the victims had been wrapped in burlap sacks before being placed in the brush along the highway. That suggested the killer may have worked in a profession where burlap was commonly used: landscaping, construction, shipping. It also suggested something else. The killer had taken time to carefully dispose of the bodies. They were hidden just far enough from the road to remain unseen, but close enough that the killer could quickly return to the highway. Investigators believed the person responsible likely knew the area extremely well, someone familiar with the quiet stretches of Ocean Parkway, possibly someone who lived nearby. Over the years, several potential suspects emerged. One of them was John Bittroff, a Long Island carpenter who was convicted of murdering 2 women in the early 1990s. Because some Gilgo victims had connections to the same region, investigators considered whether Bittroff could be responsible for some of the killings. But no definitive link was ever proven. Meanwhile, the investigation faced serious setbacks. Internal conflicts within the police department slowed progress. At one point, the FBI was blocked from fully assisting in the case. Years passed. Families waited. And the killer responsible for the Gilgo Beach murders remained free. For more than a decade, the mystery remained unsolved. Until a small piece of evidence, something as simple as a pickup truck seen by a witness, would finally lead investigators to the man they had been searching for. For more than 10 years, the Gilgo Beach murders remained unsolved. The victims' families waited. Investigators followed leads that went nowhere, and the killer continued living somewhere in plain sight. Then, in 2022, a new investigative task force took another look at the case. Fresh investigators began reviewing old evidence that had been collected years earlier. One detail immediately stood out. A witness connected to the disappearance of Amber Lynn Costello had given police a description back in 2010. She remembered seeing the client Amber left with that night, and she remembered the vehicle he was driving, a dark green Chevrolet Avalanche. For years, that clue had gone nowhere, but when investigators reopened the case, they began searching vehicle registration records for that exact truck. Eventually, the search led them to one man, Rex Heuermann. Heuermann was a Manhattan architect who lived in Massapequa Park, a quiet suburban town on Long Island. He had worked in the city for decades. To neighbors and coworkers, he appeared completely ordinary. But when investigators looked deeper, the evidence began to grow. Cell phone records showed that a phone connected to Heuermann had been in contact with multiple victims before they disappeared. Even more disturbing, investigators discovered internet searches linked to him. Searches about the Gilgo Beach investigation, searches about the victims, and searches involving violent material. The more detectives examined the evidence, the more the pieces began to fit together. For the first time in more than a decade, investigators believed they had finally found the man responsible for the murders along Ocean Parkway. Now, they just needed proof. By 2023, investigators had spent more than a year quietly building a case against Rex Heuermann. They watched him, tracked his movements, studied his habits. Heuermann lived in a modest house in Massapequa Park, Long Island, with his wife and children. He worked as an architect in Manhattan and had been commuting to the city for decades. On the surface, his life appeared completely ordinary. But investigators believed something very different was hiding beneath that normal routine. Detectives began collecting discarded items that might contain his DNA. At one point, investigators recovered a pizza crust he had thrown away. The crust was sent to a lab for testing. The results would become a major breakthrough in the case. Forensic scientists compared the DNA from the pizza crust to hair found on the burlap used to wrap one of the victims. The test revealed a genetic match. It was the strongest evidence investigators had seen in the case in years. There was another disturbing detail. Hair found near several of the victims was also linked, through mitochondrial DNA, to a female relative of Heuermann. Investigators believe the hair may have come from his wife. But authorities later stated that his wife and children were out of the state during the times the murders are believed to have occurred, and they are not considered suspects. Meanwhile, investigators discovered something else. Phone records showed that burner phones used to contact several victims had traveled between Massapequa Park and Manhattan, following the same commute Heuermann made every day. The pattern was impossible to ignore. After months of surveillance, investigators decided it was finally time to act. On July 13, 2023, plainclothes officers approached Heuermann outside his office building in Midtown Manhattan. They placed him under arrest. The quiet architect who had blended into New York City life for decades was suddenly at the center of one of the most infamous serial murder investigations in American history. He was charged with multiple counts of murder connected to the deaths of several victims discovered near Gilgo Beach. For the families who had waited years for answers, it was the first real sign that justice might finally be coming. But the investigation wasn't over, because as prosecutors continued digging into Heuermann's past, they began uncovering evidence that suggested the killings may have started much earlier than anyone originally believed. After the arrest of Rex Heuermann in 2023, investigators continued searching for connections between him and other victims discovered along Ocean Parkway. What they found suggested the case was even bigger than originally believed. At first, prosecutors charged Heuermann with the murders of 3 victims from the group known as the Gilgo Four. Soon after, he was also charged in the death of Maureen Brainard-Barnes, the 4th victim found in the same area. But investigators didn't stop there. As they examined older evidence, they began connecting Heuermann to additional killings that dated back decades. In 2024, prosecutors charged him with the murders of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Castilla. The charge involving Castilla shocked many investigators. She had been murdered in 1993, long before the Gilgo Beach bodies were discovered. If the charges are correct, it would mean the killings may have started more than 30 years ago. Later that same year, Heuermann was also indicted in connection with the murder of Valerie Mack, whose remains had been discovered in both Manorville and near Gilgo Beach. Altogether, prosecutors have linked him to 7 murders. Despite the growing list of charges, Heuermann has pleaded not guilty to every count. His trial has not yet concluded, and investigators are still working to determine whether he could be responsible for other victims discovered along Ocean Parkway. Because even with the arrests, one question still remains. Was the Gilgo Beach killer acting alone? Or are there still unsolved murders hidden in the shadows of this case? Even after the arrest of Rex Heuermann, the story of Gilgo Beach is far from over. For more than a decade, investigators believed the killer had vanished without a trace. Now prosecutors say they have a suspect responsible for at least 7 murders. But the evidence scattered along Ocean Parkway tells a much larger story. Not every victim discovered in the area has been officially linked to Heuermann. One of the most haunting examples is the unidentified victim known as Asian Doe. Despite years of investigation, the person's identity is still unknown. No family has come forward. No missing person case has been matched. Just another life that ended along the same lonely highway. There is also the lingering mystery surrounding Shannan Gilbert. Her disappearance is what led investigators to Gilgo Beach in the first place. But authorities have never officially ruled her death a homicide. Some investigators believe she may have accidentally drowned after running into the marsh during a panic. Others believe something far darker may have happened that night. Even today, the debate continues. And then there are the questions about how the investigation unfolded. For years, the case faced delays, internal conflicts within law enforcement, and missed opportunities. Some critics believe those setbacks may have allowed the killer to continue operating for years. Families of the victims have spent decades waiting for answers. For them, the arrest of a suspect is only one step toward justice. because the true story of the Gilgo Beach murders may still be incomplete. How many victims were there really? When did the killings truly begin? And was the man now accused of the crimes responsible for all of them? Or only some? Along the quiet stretch of Ocean Parkway, the wind still moves through the tall grass where the victims were found. To passing drivers, it looks like just another empty roadside. But hidden in that brush was one of the darkest secrets in modern American criminal history. And for many families, the truth behind Gilgo Beach is still waiting to be fully uncovered. The discoveries along Ocean Parkway revealed a truth that remained hidden for years. Multiple victims. Lives taken and left in silence along a quiet stretch of road. Today, investigators believe Rex Heuermann may be responsible for several of those murders. But the case is still unfolding, and many questions remain unanswered. For the families of the victims, the search for justice continues, and the stories of the women found at Gilgo Beach deserve to be remembered. Thank you for listening to Unsaid Case Files. If you want to hear more deep dives into real criminal investigations, make sure you follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find Unsaid Case Files on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Johnny Black, and this has been Unsaid Case Files.